Welcome back to the Coaches Unscripted Podcast. I'm your host, Trey. Belcher. With me, as always, is owner of Clarksburg Strength and Fitness and Gemini Fitness Solutions, Corey Smallwood. How's it going, Corey?
What's up, Trey?
Everything is good. Today, we've got a special guest, a dear friend, the host, the godfather of the fitness podcast space, the host of the Strength Coach Podcast, Anthony Renna. Welcome in, Ant.
Thanks, guys. Feels good to be, just a Yankee hanging out with a couple of good old Southern boys. Share those accents, man, for me sometimes,
Yes,
Thanks for doing this, though. I appreciate it. It's fun to be on this side sometimes.
I was just going to say, you're on the other side now. You're on the other side.
It's fun.
Yeah, and for me to have learned so much from the Strength Coach Podcast over the years, and even Strength Coach TV when you were doing those gym tours, I learned so much about this space. I got into this space in like 2017. So I learned so much through the Strength Coach Podcast. And now to have gotten into this space and to have you come on our podcast is sort of a surreal thing. So I am very appreciative of it.
Yeah, thanks, man. By the way, I loved doing Strength Coach TV. And we were talking off air about kind of the podcast thing, et cetera. And Corey was mentioning that most podcasts don't make it to episode 5. And for me, Strength Coach TV was so much fun. It was really just born out of, hey, I'm going up to perform better. And Dewey Nielsen was coming to New York and he was going to drive with me. I don't know if you guys know who Dewey Nielsen is, but Dewey was coming up. And I'm like, dude, we're going to stop at some gyms on the way up. And we did. And that's how it kind of came about. And so I traveled so much. I was going to so much continuing education. I'm like, I'm just going to bring my camera. And then I would, do these interviews and we talk about, I always figured a tour of the space would tell you, the viewer, so much about that person's philosophy, about how they train. And then we would sit down at the end and do some business, conversation. But that actually came from Coach Boyle's article, 25 years, 25 mistakes. And one of the mistakes he said he made was, or that he wished he did more of, was go visit other gyms. And sometimes coach talks about stuff and it was like, yeah, well, you didn't start that till you were successful and you had a couple bucks in your pocket, or you were getting invited to, make a couple $1,000s on an interview. So yeah, you can go visit some facilities, but the average person couldn't do that. So that's where it came from me. It was like, you know what, I'm going to bring this to people. I know a lot of people can't do this, so I want to do that. But I know went off on a little tangent there, but I just absolutely love Strength Coach TV, but I didn't really monetize it. I did a little bit for a little while, but it was hard to monetize. So if you can't monetize it after a while, sometimes it gets hard to do.
You brought up a really good point, and I didn't even think about this, is that most gyms, just this perpetual cycle of sameness. And it's because a trainer worked at a gym or 2 gyms, and then they go to open a gym, and it's the same. And I was fortunate when I was with the NFBA and Tom Plummer and traveling around, I also visited 1,000 different gyms across the country, everything from the East Bank Club to the Houstonian to some of the greatest gyms, these mega beautiful multi-million-dollar T-Boone Pickens YMCA. I mean, that was just unreal what that facility was like. And then also to some of these that were like in a shed and they stunk, and like everything, you make a mental picture of it. And then when I went to build my gym, it was very unique and kind of your anti-gym gym, because I pulled from different things that I really liked from all of these gyms around the country, and then knew I didn't want to make that mistake, and I didn't want to make that mistake and that mistake. So I think, through even, Trey watching Strength Coach TV and seeing some of what these other facilities look like from Manhattan and down in Florida and all across the country, and even Perform Better will put pictures up of some of the facilities that they design to give us and anybody interested in opening a gym, what else is out there. And that's what was really cool with the Strength Coach TV, is to show what the different possibilities are, what's actually happening outside of your 5, 10, 15 mile radius of what gyms are.
Yeah, good point about, I think, don't just learn from what they're doing right, but what they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
Right. That you always have to look at what are they doing wrong as well, or what do I not like about this? It looks horrible, or the the colors, or the smell, or the flow. So you gotta take it both ways on that.
Yeah.
Well, I can assure you, the first time I saw Boyle's place was through Strength Coach TV. The first time I saw Cressy's place. So, and I told you this, and I don't know if you remember this, but the first Perform Better 3-day summit that I went to was Orlando 2018. And you were speaking on Sunday morning. And I came up to you after the fact and I said, your talk was one of the highlights for me when I was coming to, because I knew so much of this space through Strength Coach Podcast and Strength Coach TV. So you don't know, when you're down here in the southern part of Virginia and you only know that very, very limited knowledge, you were a huge help to me and a huge benefit, because, I had the space so I could kind of model my gym after Boyle's place, but it came through Strength Coach TV where I saw that the first time.
Yeah, very cool. I'm so good to hear that. And again, and then, I was saying to somebody else, one of the coolest things about that was so many people in the very beginning, they would hear, because I went to so much continuing education, they would hear my voice. Because I'm question boy, right? I always ask questions. So I'd be like, hey, so ABC, whatever. And then somebody would come up to me after and say, hey, are you the guy that does that show with Mike Boyle, the podcast thing? This is, guys, 2008, 2009, 10, whatever, when people, and because they recognize the voice. And then they would say, you make my commute so much better, or I've learned so much, or now I learned about the FMS, or I learned about, I'm going to Mark Verstegen's mentorship, or Coach Boyle was doing a mentorship at the time. And because I heard it on the podcast, or really Strength Coach TV, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said, I watched all of the episodes of Strength Coach TV before I opened my gym. I went and I watched them all and I learned. And so thank you for doing that. And that's the greatest honor. And that kind of kept me going, even when I wasn't monetizing the shows. I was like, try to do this, And I still, by the way, I still think you're in Indy now. There's plenty of gyms in Indy, but very close to Chicago, St. Louis, Nashville, Cincy, Columbus. So I'm always like, should I just takes these road trips once in a while and just do it? But you never know, could come back.
The interesting thing too is, especially for people that have been in the industry and kind of came up without learning through YouTube and Instagram, that's where most of the newer generation is getting all of their influences from. We had Strength Coach Podcast, and it was really neat to see who should we learn from, like who were the industry leaders out there, because you couldn't just, you couldn't really necessarily Google them. They weren't having as many articles out. And unless you were picking them up in some continuing education, you didn't know. But you discovered a lot of these people. Like, you brought a lot of this to the forefront and moving the industry forward just through some of the connections that you brought to your audience.
Yeah, and I was fortunate to have, obviously, Mike Boyle, right? Part of the reason why I knew I could do this was, quote unquote, the Rolodex, which young people listening don't know what a Rolodex is, but my contact list, Mike Boyle's contact list, right? For me, I knew I had access, right? My first three guests, the three Seans, Sean Hayes, who was the strength coach for the Buffalo Bills, Sean Windle, who was the strength coach for the Indianapolis Pacers, and Sean Skane, who at the time was the strength coach for the Anaheim Ducks. So I knew I had access to all of these people. Really, I could just say, hey, Corey, I work with Mike Boyle. Hey, Trey, I work with Mike Boyle. Will you come? And everybody knew Mike. So I had that long list. I had that instant. And by the way, to Chris Poyer's credit, I went up to Rhode Island. I drove up there and I presented him with this idea. And he was all for it. We went to lunch. It was like he didn't even blink an eye, because I said, look, this is going to be a win-win-win. We're going to promote strengthcoach.com. We're going to promote Perform Better, and we're going to educate people, and win. I'm going to make some dough, right? So I knew right away, I need to make money. This is going to cost me 5 hours per episode at the time, 10 hours out of my month that I needed to make some money. So that's where really kind of it helped.
Yeah, and we're in the same boat, and Corey and I've talked about it a lot. You know, his contact list is far more extensive than mine, and so we leverage that. And we had Rob and Aaron Milani on last week, and Rob was like, "Hey, man, if you need to connect with anybody, you just let me know who and when." And it's those friendships and those connections and those, you know, those things that are the rising tide that raises all ships and helps all of us connect better and share the stories. And that's what really we're here about is the stories and the people and those connections that draw us all together, and how we can share your story, the genesis of the Strength Coach Podcast, how it all came to be, because you can get any sort of technical and tactical advice. And I would say go to the Strength Coach Podcast for that. Listen to Mike Boyle. Listen to all the guests. I mean, guys that I've, you know, Cam Joss and JB Moran, and I've got to add another name, Tony Holler, all the Feed the Cat stuff. I learned all those things through listening to the Strength Coach Podcast. And so, you know, that's not the space that we're in. We're more in the stories and the people and the connections. But how can we promote the Strength Coach Podcast? How can we connect with everybody to help us all learn more, get better, become better friendships, build a better community, and just make it all better?
Yeah. And I love that message, because right now I think especially it's even more is, you know, this idea on social media that you have to create controversy to get followers, right? And how do you do that? By kind of maybe ripping on somebody or naming names or et cetera. And that's really never been my MO. Somebody said to me one time, you should have more like 2 guests on that don't agree. Cause I did a show like that and they loved it. And I said, look, it's just not my thing.
Mm-hmm.
I want the guests to come on, whether I agree with them or not. I don't agree with Coach Boyle on so much stuff. I really don't, but I'm not arguing with him on. I just want him to present that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think you talked about, you know, rising tides, right? That's what I love. I think there's more of that in this industry than people give it credit for. But unfortunately, the controversy stuff is really what people think they need to do. And, you know, and it does work. Don't get me wrong. It does work. We see it working. So it's unfortunate, but that's really not the majority of this industry. To me, it's more of the stuff that, you know, we've made these connections over time, and just kind of keep building and helping each other.
One of the things that I'm curious about is, especially since I've been on your podcast and you are being on your podcast right before we launched ours and then doing this, I got so much growth. I am not at your level. I am JV and you're pro level. But after 400 Strength Coach podcasts, another 100 of your non-traditional way of doing it, so we're at 500 podcasts. Who would you say, or what was one of your absolute greatest guests that you've ever had? I mean, obviously Boyle is, you have some of your regulars and your favorites, but you're like, man, that one episode.
Yeah, I do love the non-strength coach interviews as well as it related to our industry. So Chris McDougall wrote the book Born to Run, started the whole revolution. So actually Gray told me about that book. He's like, you got to read this book, Born to Run. You got to get it. And, you know, always listen to Gray. And then, so I got the book and I was like, oh my God. So I contacted him and he said yes. But because back then they would say yes. I can't do that anymore. If they're not in this I had Daniel Coyle on, who wrote the Talent Code, right? He's awesome. Yeah, I love that. But by the way, he basically he wrote it was a great interview. I absolutely loved it. He was awesome. I love all of his work. But by the time he came out, what was the next book? The Culture Code.
Culture.
Mm-hmm.
By the time he came out with the Culture Code, I tried to get him through his Skype. I had a Skype. That's how I used to do the interviews, was through Skype. I contacted him through Skype, his email, Twitter messages, because we had done some Twitter stuff as well. So it wasn't like I was blocked or anything, but never even got back to me, ghosted me. So I don't blame him. Right. It was right around the time Deep Work came out and Cal Newport was telling, like, you don't have to answer every email if it's not going to be in your interest. But the problem is, over that time. So I kind of look back at those times. I'm like, oh my God, the Daniel Coyles, the Christopher McDougals, because we really helped out Christopher McDougall in the strength, in that book sales, number one, and even Vibram, because now all gym owners were starting to be like, ooh, and they started, every gym owner was wearing them and strength coaches were wearing them for a while. Right. So those interviews were always a lot of my favorite, the Daniel Coyles, the Christopher McDougals, the people outside of the industry. Somebody like Al Vermeil for me too. This is a crazy story. So Al Vermeil, I call him, and we're doing the interview on a Saturday. And so let's say we finish at 4:30. We go for like close to an hour. I'm walking the dog. Probably an hour and a half later, he calls me. I go, oh, geez, Al's calling me again. Wow, this is cool, right? So he's like, Anthony, I'm sorry. I didn't do a good enough job. I want to redo that. I was like, Al, no, there were so many gems. It was amazing. It was like, there's so much more I wanted to say. And if you ever seen Al speak, he's got 752 slides. He gets through 4 of them, right? And it was still an amazing presentation because like the stories that come up. And so we did another episode. If you look back, I think this had happened twice with him. You look back, I had to do 2 episodes back to back with Al Vermeil, which were amazing. People loved him, and he just gives so many nuggets. So that was I love doing that. Stu McGill, because this is again back in the day when Stu was still relatively new. It was funny, guys. So I'm a little nervous because it's Dr. Stu McGill, and he's not exactly like, well, his public persona is he's just like, you have to be all right. And he got mad at us at Perform Better, like the whole crowd, because we were laughing at like kind of doing this neck position. He was like, it's not funny and you're coaching and whatever. And I was like, oh my God, so I go to interview him. Of course, it's like episode 14. I lose the connection on Skype. And I'm like, come on, of all people, can't this be like Boyle or something? No big deal. And I'm like trying to call him back. And I'm like, this is a disaster. And he answers the phone without even saying hello. It's just this huge laugh like, Anthony, what happened? Oh man. So I was like total relief, did the rest of the interview. And I probably interviewed him like 3 more times after that over the years. But just people like that to be able to get, what somebody like that is thinking. And don't forget, between Mike and Gray, I'll give you a quick story on Gray. This is so crazy. You were talking about serendipitous before with like the Riverside software, Trey. So I'm starting this podcast. It's October of 2007. So Mike, he doesn't know what's going on. I'm helping Mike behind the scenes at strengthcoach.com, which just started like September 1st. And so Mike said, Ant, I asked Gray a question and he sent me these audio files. I don't really know what to do with them. So I'm like, holy shit, this is. So I go, Mike, ask Gray if we can put this on the podcast. Gray, Mike's like, Gray, I got your beers at all the Perform Betters. If you let us just use this. And Gray was like, great. Gray just wants to get it out there. He loves it. Yep. He loves doing this stuff. And for Gray, this was the perfect medium, right? Because Gray loves to talk. And so that was the start of the Ask Gray Cook segment, really. Mm-hmm. And Gray just sending the files. And I'm like, Gray, can we keep this going? He's like, yeah, let's do it. And so I would and at the time too, don't forget 2007, 2008, there was a lot of resistance to some of the things, so Gray and I were really putting out fires for a couple of years. Like, Gray, people are saying this. And so that would be the question, really. People would come up on the strengthcoach.com forum and have an argument, and Gray would just answer the question. So really that's how it came up. So I know that was a long answer to, my favorite. It is hard to choose, but those guys like Christopher McDougall and Daniel Coyle and Stu McGill, Al Vermeil, just legends like that. And then having Mark Verstegen on or Boyle or Gray, and even Nick Winkleman, who really, we started the Art of Coaching stuff on the Strength Coach podcast. That was a way for me to monetize and get more money for a segment. And, Nick was the perfect person to do that.
Trey, I love when people come on and tell all these amazing stories. It's like, I'm sorry for telling that story. That's the whole point of our podcast.
Yeah.
Sorry. The whole premise.
Sorry for saying
that
sorry.
That was awesome. Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah. For me, like, one of the questions, and I've told you, this is unscripted, so I don't write it down, but I have a couple of ideas of things that I want to know. And one of them is, what is the genesis of the Strength Coach podcast? How did it start? What was your headspace? Because, the origin stories are what brought us all here together. And, and to hear those stories about Gray, and, the thing about Gray, and he can send you 50 audio files of one question, and all 50 are different. But it's all one take. And that's the first time I filmed anything with Gray. He's standing behind the camera. He's like, all right, the rule here at FMS, one take, get it right. And you learn these things. So I keep that in my head. So it's unscripted. So, and there's very little editing to any of this, because the conversation is the gold. And so don't ever apologize for being long-winded on an answer, because that's what we're here for you to tell your story, and to not be the guy asking the questions for once, but to be the guy to tell the story, because there are other people on either side of you right now that are curious to know what your story is.
Yeah. So it's funny. I went to a conference, I think it was the end of 2005. And one of the presenters was talking about how video was coming. So I took it to heart. YouTube was just starting. So 2005, 2006, let's call it. And I said, all right, I'm going to go get a camera and a Mac. So I did. I went out, bought a camera and a Mac. On it was this software, GarageBand. And my brother is a sound engineer. So I recognized it, and I opened it up, and it said podcast. I'm like, oh, what is this? And I looked up podcast, and I was like, ooh, this is pretty cool. So I got Podcasting for Dummies. And at the time I was training at Equinox, and I knew I'm 37 at the time, right? So I started training 20 years ago at 37. So I was in the hospitality industry, in the bar business. And so I already knew that, a little bit of business, right? Stuff. I knew a lot of business. So I was like, I have a marketing degree, so all that. So like training wasn't my kind of college degree or anything like that. So I knew I needed a revenue stream. So I grew up caddying. And so the niche I wanted to do was golf, because I knew golfers are a great demographic. I lived in the greatest concentration of most historic clubs in Westchester County, or Wingfoot and Westchester Country Club and St. Andrews and all these places. And I grew up caddying at Century Country Club. And so that was my niche. And I said, I'm going to make some golf content. And I started actually a golf podcast. It was called the Better Golf with Fitness podcast. And so I was doing that first. That was my first podcast. And what happened was, Mike was doing something called michaelboyle.biz, and it was a forum. And on that forum were these just rock stars: Charlie Weingroth, Sean Skane, who was the strength coach for the Ducks, Mike Potenza, strength coach for the Sharks, Patrick Ward, who's now with the Seattle Seahawks. Just these brilliant minds, all Dewey Nielsen. It was amazing. It was Art Horn, all of these amazing strength coaches, young strength coaches, and the conversation was incredible. And so at the time, there was sportspecific.com. That was a site where, obviously, the name Sports Specific, it was pretty much the owner, Brian Lee, was looking to sell it. And he went to Chris Poirier, and Chris said, nah, it's not really worth anything. But what I think you should do is get Mike Boyle. Just give Mike Boyle half. Why don't you guys go half? Let Mike Boyle take it over. And that's really how strengthcoach.com became strengthcoach.com, where Mike was going to take it over. And basically they were going to go 50-50. So everybody on that site on michaelboyle.biz. So Mike said, listen, I'm changing this over. We're going to take over sportspecific.com. We're going to call it strengthcoach.com. You're all going to get 3 free months. Now, everybody was angry because these are all in the trenches strength coaches. And again, it's 2007. They're angry because Ryan Lee didn't really have the best reputation for, I don't want to say integrity, but he was a marketing guy, really, right? And he did a brilliant thing. He was brilliant at what he did and made a lot of money, but he let it decline. And, so people were not happy about it. So Mike had to give everybody 6 months. That's first of all, because I remember calling my friend Jeff. I was like, dude, sign up for michaelboyle.biz because he's going to give everybody 6 months at strengthcoach.com. Anyway, while everybody was complaining, I saw this as an opportunity. And I said, ooh, I've been doing the Better Golf with Fitness podcast. I said, I should do something that's going to help promote this, right? So I called Mike because I had a relationship with Mike because I was going to perform better. I went to Functional Strength Coach 1. I had gone to Mark Verstegen's mentorship. I was connecting with Mike on that level. I got Mike to come to my buddy Frank Dolan's gym. Trey, Frank.
Oh, yeah.
So I got Mike. I was giving to Mike. I introduced Mike to Geraldine Coopersmith, who was the head of Equinox Fitness Training Institute. And now he, she's booking him for educational spots there. So Mike's like, this guy's always making me money. This is awesome. So I called Mike. I said, listen, I got an idea to help you promote your new site, strengthcoach.com. It's called a podcast. I know you don't know what that is, but it's kind of like a radio show for the internet. Mike, all you got to do is answer the phone twice a month. That's it. We're going to talk about forum topics. We'll talk about new articles, what's happening, and then we'll get a strength coach on. That was the original. And I said, I already talked to Chris Poirier. They're going to sponsor it. So I'm going to make some money. You don't have to pay anything, but we're going to promote your site. Chris will be happy. We'll get, we used to do Ask the Equipment Experts with Perform Better. That's how Mike's like, let's do it. Because I don't know what it is, but I trust you. Because I started to build up that relationship. I was always around. I was working at a good space at Equinox. I was learning, getting Mike gigs. I was showing up to stuff. So that's how it started. Mike just took a chance and that was it really. And so I transitioned from the Better Golf with Fitness podcast because I wanted to devote all my time to that. And I was also doing stuff behind the scenes. That's how I started with strengthcoach.com. So I would say, Mike, look, I need to get this on the site. Is it okay if you give me access to the site behind the scenes so I can just post it? And then I started fiddling around in the site and I'd be like, Mike, we should do this or you should do that. And I can do it for you. And he loved it because the other side wasn't doing much. They were supposed to be behind the scenes, but I was doing all these like, hey, Mike, we should, we could do this or we could do that. And I was helping him out with all the technical stuff. I was just learning it because I loved it. I'm like, I'll do this for Mike Boyle, at the time. So that's when, Mike started just sending me a monthly check too. I wasn't asking for it. That's how Mike is. Mike is so appreciative of everything. And then, by the way, in 2000, I think it was 11 or 12, I forget what, Mike bought out the other half from Ryan Lee. And Mike gave me 10% of strengthcoach.com, gave it to me. The other 15%, he gave me a loan that he took out of the profits from. So I never paid. I ended up with 25% of strength. That's Mike Boyle though. Mike rewards everybody in his life. If you're doing the right thing, he takes care of you. He's not greedy. So that's really where, for me, the podcast led to, you guys know Strength Coach TV. I started strength and conditioning webinars because now I knew the strengthcoach.com software. Right. So I said, ooh, what can I do with this software? And I thought, wait, I got all the access to all these presenters, and GoToWebinar just came out. So I was like, oh, I can use this, record webinar presentations and put it on this site, strength and conditioning webinar. So I did that. By the way, I got Alan and Mike to be partners with me. So I said, I'll do all the work. You guys just pay for the initial launch. We made our money back. They made their money back in the first month. And that's how Strength Conditioning Webinar started, which I merged into strengthcoach.com when Mike gave it to me. But we started doing all of these things, and Strength Coach TV came from that, like Mike doing an article. I'm like, ooh, I have access to all these people, and I have an audience through Mike and through Gray and Mark Verstegen, Results Fitness, and all these people. So I think that's one of the things I try to tell people. You need to look and keep your eyes open for opportunity all the time. Alan Cosgrove always tells that story of the 2 shoe salesman, that the shoe company sends the 2 shoe salesman to Africa. I'll probably mess this up, but sends these 2 shoe salesmen, and the first salesman calls him back and says, listen, send me home, get me a ticket. Nobody here wears shoes. And then the other salesman calls back and says, holy cow, send me everything you got. It's amazing. Nobody here wears shoes. Right. So it's how you look at these things with opportunity. So for me, I was just trying to, instead of getting angry at everything, like, why has Mike got a partner with this guy? Or why now I have to pay $10 a month? Really? You have to pay $10 a month to learn from like the greatest strength coaches in the world? You're going to complain about that. So for me, I basically was like, what can I do to help? What can I do to serve? How can this help me as well? Look, bottom line, I want to help myself too. So like, how can I be part of this and serve people and at the same time make some dough?
You know, it's funny that you throw out terms like service and just being willing to take a chance. And I know I talk to my kids all the time about, you know, there are certain things, the most important attributes you can have. Number one, I think, is toughness. You got to be tough. You got to be able to bounce back. You got to be able to roll with the punches and keep going. But number two, you have to be humble and you have to be a servant. And when you strive to do those things, it always pays you back and you always come out better on the other side. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is to share the stories and sort of be servants of the people, be able to tell your story so that somebody can hear it and hopefully be inspired by it, to say, well, if Ant did it, then I can do it. And I've watched the Strength Coach podcast, and we were joking at, before we came on, like on the Perform Better podcast page, Strength Coach Podcast is the top of the top, but down at the bottom right now, Coaches Unscripted Podcast. So we're in the room, and that's what really matters. And that's, and it's a beautiful thing. And you just know that you and what you've done over the years has inspired me, and I know has inspired Corey. And so to be able to have you on our show, and Corey's been on your show, and to be able to share all this stuff together, man, it's so cool to experience.
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that. And I think that's what we just got to keep, all of us have to keep reminding ourselves of that why. It's a little cliche, but why are we doing this? We want to, for me, I always said, okay, cool. I want to help fitness professionals become successful and make an impact in the world. How do I do that? Right. When you have that mission statement, it starts to answer questions for you. So should I go on this podcast? Should I do Strength Coach TV, or what can I do to help people? And at the same time, with my mission, right? So, and if I'm not making money, am I still helping fitness professionals become better and become successful and make an impact in the world? Right. So that's, for me, is we kind of got to keep going back to that. So hopefully you guys will, even after 50 episodes, if you feel like, man, why are we doing this? We're spending a lot of time. You just kind of go back to that, remembering, because this business, the podcast business, it's tough. We're dealing with, for example, ESPN. They'll do their regular show and then repurpose part of it as a podcast, right? And it's like, now I got to deal with them. Then, you see, we're not going to compete with a Joe Rogan right now, right? We have a different demographic, but still, you have all of these people. Eric Cressy, that's a great example. I mean, people love Eric, right? He's a great strength coach. He's super smart. He comes up with a podcast now. It's like, man, now you got to compete with Eric Cressy, right? And I was telling you, Chris Barrio was saying to me, he's like, Ant, every one of my presenters has a podcast now. It's tough. So you're competing. You're quote unquote competing with all these people. You're not. We're all just trying to provide that information. We're all going to do it differently. We're all going to have our own style of how we interview, what we want to talk about. Like you guys have your direction We want to talk about the stories behind this stuff. So I think it's cool.
And you've been doing this for 20 years, and you seem to always be like one step ahead, right? Everybody, you've been doing podcasts. Now everybody's doing a podcast. You started those webinars, the fitness webinars. Now everybody's doing fitness webinars. It's like, so what do you see in the next 5 years, right? Everybody now has a podcast. So what's next? What's Ant going to get his hands dirty with next?
Yeah, I think this video podcast is more a reflection of that, in terms of saying, I think we always go back, like that idea. Alan always liked to say the pendulum always swings, right? We always get that pendulum swinging, right? And so right now it's so far on one side with social media, and I think it's coming back a little bit. I had Jonathan Goodman on, and he was talking about how the internet, or kind of social media, is overrated for building a business, but it's underrated for building connections and education, right? So how are you using those connections? So the best people right now on Instagram they don't necessarily need to have so many followers, but they're connecting with those people through direct messages, etc. Right? So I think for me, I think we're going to see more of this. I think we're going to come back to more of this personal stuff, because now people are starting to be like, that's AI, or, right, you're seeing all these videos or whatever. You don't know what to think anymore. And you can kind of tell, right? You can kind of tell when things are a little bit like, that doesn't seem right. But I think people are going to resonate with the stories of the in the trenches coaches, and trying to be like, yeah, how can we be better at engagement? Because we've gone so far, especially kind of after COVID, and really this generation that's kind of coming up with, texting each other while being in the same room. And we've seen a decline in live stuff, live educational stuff. But I think it's going to come back a little bit more. And as we kind of get more creative with how we are presenting some of this when we're going into getting some of these educational workshops or summits or et cetera. Like, you can even see at Perform Better what they're doing. They're having one room as a networking room, right? So you can go and, speak with that presenter, different presenters during the day. You can actually sit down with them besides the social. So Chris has moved towards that, right? So I think that's what we're seeing. So really, for me personally, I think that personal brand and like that, more of that connection, is really where I think is the next piece of the puzzle. Is you went that far, you're doing all these great things with social media and using AI, but now you have to make sure you're still connecting with people. How do you do that? How do you get better at that? And how do you cultivate that? I think that's really where we're moving towards.
Love it.
Well,
love it, man.
Yeah. And that's you talk about those things and the connections. Like when Corey and I got connected, that was through Gerard Griffey. And I called Griff and I said, hey, who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to connect with? Who are the people that I need to know? And he said, you need to meet Corey. You and Corey are a lot alike. He said, I think you guys will hit it off. And then he was 100% right. And we've told that story. I think that comes up like at least once every episode. But then it's, who am I? What is my angle? I'm not going to be the best tactical and technical guy. I'm not going to be Gray Cook or Lee Burton, even though these are the guys I've learned from. This is the stories, the people that we talk about, sort of the sort of Southern genteel way, but that's sitting around telling stories and listening to people's stories. That's what drives me. And Corey is, we're so much alike that it only makes sense for this to be, that the personal connections and the stories behind the people who are out there doing things like yourself with the Strength Coach Podcast, and being early adopters and pioneers in these fields. So to be able to ask the questions and get you to tell the stories, those are the things that I just sit back and I'm just, very thankful to be able to be a part of it. So, the connection, that is the essence of everything that we do here.
And that's the thing with Ant, even talking about how he had Vermeil on twice, and he's had to have, a lot of these guests on more than once because they get into tell the story. We're definitely going to have Ant on again because of, it's 25 years, man. You got so many stories that we're just curious about, and less about the nuts and bolts of training, but like, all the cool people that you just dropped John Goodman's name, and you just dropped like all these people that every time you talk, it's like, man, I wonder what that was like. And man, I wonder what that was like. Or what's that guy like off camera, because we even chatted 20 minutes before hitting, record. That's, what was Stu McGill like? What was, Sumit and Bill Parisi and all the great guests that you had on there. You just have these awesome stories.
I think too, what I love what you guys are doing is unscripted. So for everybody, when you're on my podcast, I send you a Calendly link, and in that link, it'll say, give me your email, and it'll say, okay, give me 3 things you want to talk about. Whether just tell me something, maybe think about things you're angry about in the industry, things you don't like to see. That usually gets ideas going. It'll say, give me your, any links to articles. Give me all of your social media. So I do that really more for time, so I can get all that out. But I think one thing that I try to do, and this is what I love about what you guys are doing, I did not get anything from these guys. I got an email from this guy, Charles Belcher III. I'm like, who the hell is that? Because I call him Trey. And I'm like, whoa, wait, that's Trey. So kind of came up, and there wasn't anything to say, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, which I absolutely love. And I try to tell people ask me about interview, and I'm like, look, don't over prepare. Because if you over prepare, all you're doing is waiting to ask those questions. Like, have a direction that you want to go, make it a conversation. And by the way, that will also help you listen. So if I don't go into an interview a little scared, I'm like, something's wrong. This isn't going to be good, because when I'm scared, you know what I mean? But
Sure.
If I'm a little nervous about how this is going to come out, that means I'm paying attention to you a little bit more. It's just something I need to do. I need to pay attention a little bit more. So if I don't know everything, I can get questions. Questions come up based on your answer. So now I'm a little bit more in the moment when I am trying to think of things, because a lot of times if you have too many questions, you're waiting, and some people ask the question, wait, that person just answered, you weren't listening, you were worried about that next question. So just be casual about it. That's what I love about the unscripted ideas, that like, let's tell some stories. Let's have a conversation. By the way, the 20 minutes, you just referenced that 20 minutes, Core. And I think it's almost should be built into, hey, we're going to have a conversation for 15 minutes. Cause I always used to do, cause don't forget 2007, 2008, I would have these amazing strength coaches who were so nervous. They'd say, hey, what are we going to talk about? I'm like, what you do every day for 8 hours, yelling at people, laughing with people, talking to people. I'm like, that's all we're doing. We're just going to have a conversation. So I would always get on. By the way, these were big people that were scared. Look at the Al Vermeil story, right? And that wasn't good enough, because these people, a lot of them are perfectionists, and they're worried about giving their best performance. And so for me, I would always try to go in a different direction. It's kind of like that old interview technique where I would look and like right now, Corey's pixelated, so I can't see everything. So I can't see the books on his shelf, but I might pick a book and say, Corey, did you read this? And then that kind of disarms them. Like I might say to Trey, it was Charlie Brown, your favorite cartoon character, because that painting behind him, right? Because it looks like Charlie Brown's shirt. So, but I would break the ice and make it laugh. And then, so we would have this conversation for 5 or 10. And then that would flow into, so by the time I'm like, hey, whatever, we would talk, and they would just boom, go. And to your point, you guys mentioned it to me. I mentioned it to so many people. I'm like, there is no time limit for you. You will never be talking too much. Keep going. Don't, like you guys said, don't apologize. I just say, just keep talking. This is about you. And I've even gotten a little bit of crap. Like, you should make that more about you. Like, you should throw some more stuff in. I'm like, it is not about me. Nobody wants to hear it from me. They want to hear for this interview. Now with Coach Boyle, I'll throw my stuff in there because it relates to the question, but I try to make it about that person and let them go with it and just add relevant things to the conversation from an interview's perspective.
Sure. And I can tell you, from watching you, we've had a few conversations over the years, not a lot, but to have you on and to be asking the questions, hey, I'm thinking like, I hope I measure up. I hope I'm, acquit myself well, but the only thing that I was ever curious about was the origin of the Strength Coach podcast. That's the only thing that I had in my mind.
Yeah.
Beyond that, this is totally conversational because that's really me. But it's let's just talk. I'm going to throw something out there. Corey's going to throw stuff out there and you just tell the stories, man.
Yeah. The story stuff is always very cool. I think Seth Godin had a great line. He said, if you want to do a presentation, just come up with 10 stories and tell the 10 stories, right? Depending on how much time you have, like 3 stories or 5 stories, or just come up with a bunch of stories or, at least throw them within your presentation. You need to throw those stories in there. There's a great book called Lead with a Story, and it gives you a lot of ideas about when you're doing a presentation about and they're true stories, but they can relate to a lot of different situations. So I think it's kind of a cool way because people love to hear the stories. I actually had the podcast Stop and Give Me 20 for a while. I did, I think 58 episodes of that. And the first question would be like, Corey, what's your story? How did you get into fitness? That was the idea. Like, what's your fitness story? Not how you got into the business. How did you get into a love of fitness? So to, kind of exactly what you guys are doing. Like, let's hear some stories about how this all started.
Yeah, and I hope that even through this, I always try to tie it back into the business side of gyms, because I think everybody, if you're going to spend an hour or 40 minutes or 30 minutes with us, what are some takeaways from it as well? And I think everybody doing a podcast is a great way to own your community, to own your market and be the expert outside of your 4 walls with fitness. And through Trey and my experience, through your experience, say everybody can do it. You just have to, do it, take that leap, and it gets better every episode that you do. You're going to learn from it. We'll look back from podcast 50 to podcast 5 and be like, what the hell were we doing? We got to have that person back on, because wow, that was the growth. And I think if it's a business takeaway from this is, if you want to start a podcast, get yourself a little camera, get yourself a computer, get Riverside or some sort of AI driven software and start recording, start putting yourself out there and just get started. And who knows, 20 years later, you have Strength Coach Podcast, Strength Coach TV, strengthcoach.com, and going more into this visual aspect of it as well. I mean, hey, anybody can do it.
Yeah, and it's awesome because it's led to so many things. It led to, a revenue for a couple of years with strength and conditioning webinars. I started hockeystrengthandconditioning.com based on the same idea. Let me get a couple of guys, Mike Potenza, Sean Skane, Coach Boyle, Kevin Neild. Let's get them and let's start this site, right? I'm no longer a part of that, it's still going, but led to strengthcoach.com, led to Body by Boyle, or Mike Boyle, MBSC.TV, which, previously. So I was part of that as well. And I sold those strengthcoach.com and MBSC.TV to Kevin Carr and Brendan Rearick during right around 2020. So, but it's led to me being on the Perform Better circuit. It led to my book, Be Like the Best, right? It led to all these other things. The genesis of so many of those things can, to your point, just go and just start it. Ready, fire, aim is just great philosophy, right? And don't overthink it. I know Trey and I were having a long conversation about the different software and what it can do and all these things and a camera, and things can get overwhelming, but just Just do it. You guys, you remarked about it looked like I was in a dark room when I was interviewing Coach Boyle for my last episode, right? I mean, right now it's totally different. I have like some blue lights coming this way and then the red kind of going into the other side and the white light this way. So now but it's evolving, so and it's okay. It's okay for it to be like that. I think I just finished Michael Gervais' book. The first step to mastery is to stop worrying about what other people think. And that we get that stuff in our head so much and it prevents us from doing stuff.
Well, and I know we gotta wrap this thing up. Corey's got his next session coming in, but you're the godfather in this thing. So it would be foolish for me to try to plug your show. So let's hear the Anthony Renna Strength Coach Podcast plug.
Yeah, well, hey, look, we're at the start of a new era where we're going to video, and with my idea with partially with the video is at some point soon. Again, this is evolving. Is to be able to talk to Coach Boyle. Like for example, last episode we're talking about trap bar deadlifts versus high handle trap bar deadlifts versus partial squats. So during that conversation, I want to be able to put those videos in. Now people can go on Spotify or YouTube and see those, right? I don't want to just have a link. I want them to be watching that conversation, and that's going to come. It's not right now because I'm editing and I have to learn stuff and that takes more time, but that's the direction that we're going with the Strength Coach Podcast, to be able to kind of like even the Perform Better ads. Like I was showing the catalog, and then they have a lot of education coming up. So I was showing different things that's happening with Perform Better coming up, right? From an educational perspective. So I think it's going to add to the podcast. So I'm not going anywhere. Coach Boyle's not going anywhere. We're going to keep doing this, even though admittedly listeners used to be, 10,000 people in the first month, but that was 7-8 years ago. Now everybody and their mother has a podcast. So it's tough to compete with some of these people, but we're still making an impact on some people. And when you're being able to just even impact a small amount of people, it's all worth it. So we're still having some great conversations on the Strength Coach Podcast. So check it out on Spotify and YouTube. Watch us and you listen to.
There you have it, folks, the great Anthony Renna. So to wrap this thing up, we want to thank you for joining us on the Coaches Unscripted podcast. We hope today's stories have inspired and empowered you in your coaching journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow coaches. Connect with us on Instagram at Coaches Unscripted Podcast to continue the conversation and stay updated on future episodes. Until next time, for Corey Smallwood, the great Anthony Renna, I'm Trey Belcher. Keep coaching from the heart and building strong communities.